Well, I just want to say that I spent 5 very happy years of my life in Bangalore from 89 to 94 on MG Road at the Times of India office. They were really wonderful times. There's a special something about this city. You heard about a melting pot. Uh, a melting pot seems to imply a kind of a similarity, a sameness. But what is lovely about Bangalore is that you have a melting pot without any of the differences and divergences being removed, but all of them being, in a sense, celebrated. So it's a very unique kind of culture, and I would like to say I was privileged to be here, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here now in the Bangalore International Center. I mean, this is something that I absolutely could not pass up. Now, since I'm talking a little bit about autobiography, let me spend a minute and a half more and say there was a period in my life when it was difficult for me to write in what's called mainstream media. I'm not going to get into reasons for that, but I mean, it was difficult. And there were two publications that regularly carried my writings. One was called Radiance. It's the official magazine of the Jamaat-e-Islami. The other is called Organizer, which is the official publication of the RSS. So depending on which magazine you read, I was either an Islamic fanatic or I was a Hindu fanatic. I had to be one of either. Nobody except Islamic fanatics wrote for Radiance. Nobody except Hindu fanatics wrote for the Organizer. So luckily, after some point in time, the cross currents of domestic politics in India made it possible for me to once again get into the mainstream of reporting. And in case Radiance and Organizer have missed my writing, they haven't communicated that to me. Let me put it that way. You know, they've been very civilized about it, but they've not communicated that to me. Well, I mean, briefly, so like you view an elephant depends on which angle you look at. If you look at my writing, depending on the writing that you look at, depending on the angle in which you look at, I'll be different things to different people. So, from that point of view, I'd only like to say I'm happy to be here, back in Bangalore. I'm happy to be reminded of my days here in 89 and 94. And I think I see quite a few people here who have been, in a sense, known to me from that period. And I would like to say I'm delighted to be here and delighted that they're here, delighted that all of you have spared time in Bangalore traffic. Because I must say that from Reva University to here, I saw quite enough of Bangalore, frankly. One does love the city very much. But at the same time, even when you love a city, there could be, you may have a little bit of a, what do I say, a little bit of a problem with some of the roads and some of the traffic. But anyway, look, this book, there were two books that were written by me around the same period. One was called 75 Years of Indian Foreign Policy. That book was published by Rupa Publishers, and that book essentially was what I felt we could have done to take advantage of the opportunities that were available in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and right up to now, let's put it that way, when the book came out, which was last August. This book is essentially giving the context to that book. And this book is about what some of us for some time have been calling Cold War 2.0. Now, you have a large number of people who say, no, it can't be, because they confuse Cold War 2.0 with Cold War 1.0. It's completely different. It's like, for example, you have two children, and one child is completely different from the other. So if you look for one child in the other child, you don't find it. And then you say, how can they be brothers or sisters or whatever? But they are brothers and sisters. China is not the United States. The 21st century is not the 20th century. The Indo-Pacific is not the Atlantic. And the confrontation that's taking place now is taking place in a very different series of arenas than was the confrontation taking place in the time of the first Cold War. Now, why I'm talking about Cold War 2.0 is basically because, and again, let me say that, Vikram here was talking about experts. And I was telling Vikram that, anytime you think somebody is an expert, you made a mistake. Because it's very difficult to be an expert in something as rapidly changing, as rapidly different, and frankly, as complex, if I may say so, as what has been titled here, the cross currents of history. But the reality of the situation is that for quite some time, it has been evident that you have the Communist Party of China, the CCP, founded a little more than 100 years ago. From the beginning of that time, its charter was very clear. And its charter was that this is the philosophy, this is the ideology, this is the people. And essentially it was based on a Han, the concept of the Han people. And the Han people concept is not an ethnic concept. It's not like saying white people or whatever. It's different. It's more of a cultural construct. So what happens is that you absorb a certain cultural mix, and then you're defined as Han. I know, for example, children of families where the husband or the wife is Indian and the spouse is Chinese, and they are brought up as Han Chinese in China, because they're living in China, and they're accepted as Han Chinese. So it's not racism in the classic sense in which we define racism, but I would say it's pride in it's more of a cultural synthesis, and it's pride in that synthesis, except that the Communist Party has evolved an entirely different kind of cultural synthesis from the classical Chinese synthesis. If you go to Taiwan, for example, you will see the tea ceremony in the old imperial Chinese form. You go to PRC, you're not going to see that happen. There's a huge difference in the culture of the PRC and classical Chinese culture, which is much bigger difference than you see in Taiwan, or, for example, Malaysian Chinese, or Singaporean Chinese, or Indonesian Chinese, or Thai, Chinese, and classical Chinese culture. So, again, as I said, the point was that even in the 1950s, late 1950s, if you study the polemics that were taking place by the 60s, let's say, between the PRC and the USSR, at that point in time, there was no certainty about who would win the first Cold War. There was a very real probability that the USSR and the USSR system would prevail. And from that point in time, you see the polemics between, say, the PRC, Mao, for example, and the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and the kind of names that the Chinese Communist Party would call its Soviet counterpart. And you will understand this feeling that, look, you chaps are pretending to be the leaders, the vanguard, so to speak, of the communist movement. Sorry, we are the vanguard. We are the true communist movement. And you chaps are, low life. Let's put it that way. Now, Americans, the good or bad thing about America, they don't pick up hints. I think sometimes it's a good thing because a lot of hints I don't think one should pick up. It may not be good for blood pressure. But anyway, they took a while to pick up the hint that China, and that is the PRC. When I say China, I mean the PRC. But let me tell you very clearly, communist Chinese are different from non-communist Chinese. The top 20% of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, or whatever Chinese way you want to call it, is very different from the bottom 80% of that party. And the top 1% of that party is different from the rest of that party. And the top 1% of that 1% is very, very different from everybody else. And it's that 1% of 1% of 1% that runs the entire country. I must say that I've been to China dozens of times. Sometimes alone, sometimes a lot of, with my wife, Lakshmi. I've always gone there courtesy the Communist Party of China. Because if you go to China and you don't go there courtesy the Communist Party of China, you are a tourist. You can see the Ming vases, you can see the museums, you can see the roads, but you really have no access, in a sense, to what is the thinking and happenings that are going on in the governance heart of China. In the part of China that is really relevant in policy, and regrettably some of us have been involved in policy for quite some time. So I've always gone there as I wouldn't say a guest, because one pays one's own way in most part, but as through the Communist Party. If you go to the United States, there's different. Let's say, for example, in the 1990s, when you had Bill Clinton as the President of the United States, he was, in my view, horribly anti-Indian. I'm sure that there must be quite a few admirers of Bill Clinton in Bangalore, as there are in other parts of the country. And certainly he got a rapturous reception when he finally came to India in the final weeks of his presidency. But the man was obsessed about two things. One was getting rid of our space capability, our nuclear capability, our missile capability, getting rid of it. Essentially giving the Chinese a monopoly in Asia of those capabilities. And secondly, he was very obsessed about the northernmost state of India and what should be done with the northernmost state of India. And Bill Clinton didn't really believe that India had, our point of view and Bill Clinton's point of view is very different. And he put a lot of pressure on Narasimha Rao mainly. He was the Prime Minister at that point in time. And one good thing about Narasimha Rao, he will say no without saying anything. He will just look at you and stare at you and say, I see, I see. What he means by that I see is, well, I don't care what you're saying. I'm just not going to listen to you, but I'm too civilized a person. I come from Andhra Pradesh, and we are too civilized a people to say that we don't agree with you. But if you look into my eyes, you'll know what I mean. So he kept that at bay. But during those times, a chap like me, who frankly, if you look, these days, thanks to Google and whatever, you can see a lot of my writings, a lot of them. And you're welcome to comb through them and evolve for yourself what kind of, in Vikram's terms, expert or non-expert I am. If, let's say, the White House doesn't like you, it could very well be that the US Congress may love you. Maybe because the White House doesn't like you. If the Democrats don't like you, the Republicans may love you. In fact, during the 90s, and I'm going to be neither politically correct or incorrect, I'm just going to be correct in my recollections. I was low life from India. Who the heck bothered about India in those days, What was India? Nothing. And you had some chap from India coming, and trying to tell us what to do with our thing and what to do with our policy about India. We were low life. If you're low life, you're on the pavement and nobody wants to look at you. There were other forms of low life at that point in time in the US. And they were called, the neocons, the neoconservatives, the chaps around George Bush and the chaps around, those kind of guys who later on became hugely influential in the United States under Bush and Cheney. At that point in time, nobody listened to them. Nobody listened to me. So we formed a perfect match. and we developed a lot of linkages with each other. And of course, I must confess, a lot of linkages with the other groups as well. But with the neocons, because both of us were, at that point in time, people nobody listened to in Clinton's Washington. I mean, nobody likes not being listened to. So I've still got a little bit of a negative feeling about the Clintons, which I agree. But the point is that during Bill Clinton's time, the relationship with China, there was no technology available to India. The entire store was opened, availability to China. At that point in time, some of us pointed out, watch out, these guys are not favoring your system. They're not going to suddenly get, because they got McDonald's and they got Kentucky Fried Chicken, it doesn't mean that the Communist Party is going to become even a Republican Party on steroids. Forget about a Democratic Party, a Republican or a neocon on steroids. I mean, which to some people is better and to other people is worse than a Republican on steroids. They're not going to become that. So, frankly, some of us have been tracking the inevitable falling out of the interests of the United States and the PRC. But very importantly, that kind of thing became very visible in 2012 when Xi Jinping took over. Xi Jinping has got himself in the mold of what he wants to basically outshine Mao Zedong. Now, the difference between India and the United States, and this is something that was first said by a gentleman named Manmohan Singh, who was actually a very good prime minister and could have been a much better prime minister if he had been the party president also, but he was not. But anyway, he pointed out that when India got its freedom, over the few years before that, a large part of India separated during partition. Myanmar separated, Sri Lanka separated, different other parts of what was at one time run from British. The ASEAN countries of today, what we call the Middle East in classic textbooks, they had the Indian rupee. We basically inherited a shrunken country. When Mao Zedong took over in 1949 and set up the People's Republic of China, he doubled the land area of China. He took over Tibet, he took over Xinjiang, he took over Manchuria, he took over Inner Mongolia. He didn't bother about Taiwan, frankly, because he thought he could do it anytime later or whatever, or maybe he wasn't interested enough. But that's but today what you're seeing, the South China Sea, for example, it's become almost a PLA lake. You have these islands here. And the problem now is when you have a situation, I mean, Mahatma Gandhi, there are some things he said and did that we may not, but some things were very, very prescient. And he said that this is a world where there's enough to meet every human being's need, but not to meet every human being's greed. So when you have a leadership that's very confident, that's expansionist, that basically believes it has the right to impose its ideology, and its ideology is based on its own superiority of its own system on the rest of the world. The rest of the world has a problem. And today, we are seeing that in the South China Sea. You're seeing that in the steady erosion of the air and sea space of Taiwan, the attacks on the land space of Taiwan, the attacks on the land space of India, and very importantly, in cyberspace. Now, I have a small research team, let's put it that way, that does some pretty good research. And they checked out, and all this is there on record because I've written about it. In the United States and India in particular, the internet space, internet chat rooms and internet fora have essentially, you have had a kind of an infiltration, a penetration by PRC elements to try and widen the fault lines in a society so that fringes become stronger and the moderate middle becomes weaker. Any society is healthy when the moderate middle expands and the fringes shrink. Any fringe, when they start expanding, in the United States, it could be black and white. In India, it could be people of different faiths, different regions, different religions, whatever, different languages. When those who believe that in what exclusivism, those who believe in supremacy, racial supremacy is bad, religious supremacy is bad. Essentially, if you look at the Sanatana Dharma doctrine, is that there are millions of paths towards the divinity, and each path is a good path. You're not going to stand in the way of that path, and that diversity is extremely important for a healthy society. Now you have in the internet space, the problem is you have a comfortable house, for example. Yesterday I had a dinner at a very comfortable house. And I'm not going to, since I keep my sources secret, I'm not going to name whose house I had dinner with. A very comfortable place. So like that, we are comfortable in our internet space. Let's say, for example, I don't like the United States. There are internet chat rooms and internet things which also everybody doesn't like the United States. And I love going there. And finally, I stopped going anywhere else. Let's say I love China. You have internet chat rooms that I love China. And more sinister, the fact is that these, through algorithms and through other means, they not only create a feeling that this is a benign country, it also creates a feeling of distaste, distrust towards your own country. So you start feeling a loss of confidence in the future of your own country. And remember, we are a very young country. You look, for example, at West Asia. Just go west of India. Very, very young people. India, very young people. And if you start losing hope and you start losing confidence, then you start adopting radical points of view because you have nothing to lose. If you feel you have a very bright future ahead of you, you work hard, you study hard, you follow, a path, and until you believe you can reach. If you feel that goal is beyond reach, you don't do that. And very often you can run berserk, and very often you can be cannon fodder for people who have an affinity towards that kind of activity. So this is the point I'd like to say very, very clearly. And the point I'd like to say very clearly is that this kind of activity has been taking place through algorithms, for example, algorithm writers, etc., etc. Because a platform is as good as its algos. Let's say, for example, you have an algorithm writer on a particular platform who, for some reason, likes me. And an algorithm is created in which, if you Google my name, all the good parts about me come to the surface. And unless you really work very, very, very hard, you're not going to come across anything nasty about me unless you really do a very deep dive search. On the other hand, you have an algorithm writer who doesn't like me very much. Then all the nasty things, and believe me, there have been quite a few. Quite a few, if I may say so. They come to the surface, and all the nice things are buried way, way down below. You understand? So from that point of view, this kind of an activity has been taking place, and so we find a widening of fault lines, a widening of people who frankly, for no reason, start disliking on the basis of a completely wrong picture of the reality, which, again, I come back to my old theory of Indutva, and I'd like to say that, I'm happy I wrote that article in the early part of the 1990s in the Times of India. My point was very simple and very obvious point, that the DNA of every Indian is a compound of the Western, the Mughal, and the Vedic. There's a Westerner in all of us. There's a Vedic in all of us. There's a Mughal aspect in all of us. I remember back in the 90s, before Mr. Vajpayee came to power, talking with somebody who became very powerful when he did come to power. And he was arguing about, this kind of culture. And I pointed out that his daughter was wearing a salwar kameez. And I pointed out that the food on the table, I am a vegetarian, so I didn't eat a lot of the food on the table. The food on the table was, as far as I could tell, Mughlai food. So on the one hand, he's saying the Mughals are awful. On the other hand, his daughter is wearing a Mughal outfit and he's eating Mughlai food. So so where is where's the logic here? So what I'm trying to say is that it's very important that we understand this essential strength. And I want to end by saying it's important we understand we have about 7,000 years of history. During certain periods of time, mainly the British period of time, we completely forgot about the whole of our history. Now, it's important for each of us as individuals to remember our childhood, to remember our adolescence, to remember our early adulthood, our middle age, and, I must confess that I've reached that stage. I'm not middle-aged, but I'm not going to tell you what I am because, I certainly am not going to, make a confession of that sort. But it's important to remember all that. And each of these 7,000 years belongs to all of us. It's not that one part belongs to one section and one part belongs to one section and one part belongs to the other. It's a compound of all of us. And it's that compound that makes us strong as a people. It's that compound that makes this country and its people welcome in West Asia, welcome in ASEAN, welcome in the United States, welcome in Europe, welcome across the board. And the final point before Vikram starts, reading the riot act to me, because I'm a Malayali, I must confess, and I don't think any Malayali here will disagree with me when I point out that restricting a Malayali to 15 minutes is the worst form of torture. It's absolutely, a human rights violation beyond any other violation, but somehow I've got to obey Vikram and do it. I simply want to say the Chinese took the maximum advantage from Cold War 1.0. They opportunistically sided with the United States against the USSR, which they hated. And they got a tremendous benefit out of it. Today, Chinese economy is 5 times our economy. At 1980s, we were roughly equal. When Mao was there and when we started independence, they were much less than half of what we were. Today, we have the same opportunity. If we make the right geopolitical choices in a fractured world, we have the same opportunity that the Chinese had in Cold War 1.0. And the biggest fear of the Chinese is that we will do that. The biggest fear is that industries that are relocating from China will migrate to India in large numbers. You have a regulatory framework, all these things have got to be changed, you've got to have a social ambience. All that is a work in progress. But let me say, I'm optimistic about a younger generation. I'm very optimistic, and not entirely because most of what I say, most of my, my internet, rantings or whatever you call it, books, younger people seem to have quite a greater affinity to that. So obviously, I like people who like me. So, having said that, I'd like to point out this is our chance and our opportunity to take advantage of Cold War 2.0 for the younger generation, make the correct geopolitical choices so that the next 25 years will truly be a golden age in terms of prosperity of the Indian people and, very importantly, an age in which we rediscover the reality of a common DNA. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat, for a very enlightening 30 minutes. Question, you said India needs to make the right geopolitical choices. Could you expand a bit more on what they are, particularly with reference to the US and Russia? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to say that we really don't have a choice in between when it's a question of US and China. The Chinese are not giving us a choice for the simple reason that they know we are the one country that can replace them on top of the mountain. The Chinese are saying there can only be one tiger on the mountain top. They are the tiger. The only one country that has the absorbent capacity to take a lot of the higher tech, etc., manufacturing from them is India. So in this situation, the default option has got to be a closer relationship with the United States. This is something which Indians have been doing from a long time, voting with their feet. You have about 5 million Indian Americans doing extremely well there. You have a lot of techies, for example. I've gone to parts of Silicon Valley, and I mean, in many, I've gone to these laboratories, 30-40% and more are Indian origin, either Indian American or ethnic Indian. So, in my personal view, Noreen, that it's very clear. Like the Chinese basically chose the United States, or rather, the United States chose China. China had basically been interested in the United States from the late 50s. In the late 50s, Mao Zedong said, "I want to swim in the Mississippi River." Now, the Chinese are a very subtle people. What he meant was, I want to be friendly with the United States. I'm not sure that, the country he was addressing was equally subtle where policy making is concerned. So they didn't get it until Richard Nixon got it. Let's put it that way, in the 70s. In the same way, we need to be, let's be honest, a bit opportunistic. I would like to say that I deeply admire the notion of non-opportunism, allowing opportunities to pass. Like, for example, a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Like, for example, Balochistan, the port of Gwadar at that point in time. Like, for example, taking the whole of POK at a point in time. It's wonderful. And even, for example, in what I regard as a horrible mistake of partition on the ground of religion. Because religion absolutely does not define your nationality. Whether you're a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Jain or a Buddhist or a Christian, it cannot define your nationality. And that was a very unfortunate situation. In the United States, Abraham Lincoln, a man of peace, fought a war for the United States. We allowed ourselves to be divided on a ground which I do not believe is a logical ground. And the aftershocks of that are continuing to this day. And I want to again be politically correct or politically incorrect. And I'd like to say that thanks to my writing in Radiance, frankly, and thanks to my writing in Organizer, when I say things which are not very palatable to either side, they don't acknowledge me as an enemy. They say that this guy may be misled on something, but he's still a friend. So I'd like to say from the very beginning, for many decades I've been saying, for example, that just as you have in this particular problem in Gaza, the Al-Aqsa Masjid, it's one of the three holy sites of Islam, Makkah, Medina, and the Al-Aqsa Qibla. Now, when you had some individuals, Israeli citizens, go there in a way which did not seem to be very respectful, that gave the perfect excuse to Hamas to launch its terror operation. Personally, that is a bad move, and it was a mistake. I'm not saying that Hamas would not have attacked Israel. They would have, but you gave them the perfect excuse to attack Israel. So from that point of view, I'd like to say, there are three holy sites for the Hindu community: Kashi, Mathura, and Ayodhya. I've been active since about the 1990s in a resolution of these three sites, especially in the Ram temple matter. There was a resolution in the 1990s, but that was torpedoed mainly because of not the Muslim side, but the other side, frankly. An extensive discussion took place in Deoband and all that for that. Because you have people who say, why only 3? Why not 30,000? Why not 300,000? That's absurd. Why only 3? Because these 3 are regarded as birthplaces. The birthplace of Lord Ram, the birthplace of Lord Krishna. And as far as the Gyanvapi is concerned, as you know, the spiritual energy of Lord Shiva. And from that point of view, only these 3 are really important. But in my view, governments that came after 1947 made a mistake in not making that gesture. Because by not making that gesture, you have in fact basically created a situation in which the fringe can be nourished. So whether it was what was seen at the Al-Aqsa Masjid, or whether it was the basically avoiding what I would call a historical injustice. Because I have been saying from decades, restore Kashi, Mathura and Ayodhya to what they were during the time of Shah Jahan and Jahangir. I was not saying that you restore it to the Vedic period. Shah Jahan and Jahangir understood the importance of these 3 sites, and they understood the importance in ensuring that the Mughal Empire remained intact. When this understanding was broken, that was the beginning of the end of the Mughal Empire, and it perished soon after Aurangzeb did. So that's what I was saying. So what I'm trying to say is essentially that, now you have people who say 30,000, mosques should be demolished. It's ridiculous. You have people who say none of this should happen. Ram Temple, XYZ, no. Even these 3 should not be given up. I would like to say from my experience, I have not seen a community in India, when you explain the argument to them, any community, I'd like to point out. And when I say any community, I mean community that should be expected to be opposed to it. Absolutely none. From the time in the 1990s when we were discussing with people who were considered to be very hardline, where certain faiths were concerned, they understood the logic of this birthplace logic and holding it at 3 places. And it's not only I who have been saying this. You have people who have been very loudly espousing this so-called Hindu cause. Now, my philosophy is Indutva. It's not anything else. And Indutva means that common DNA of all 3 faces. I mean, even they say that these 3 are important. So what I want to say very clearly is, I would like to see a situation in which, frankly, the fringes shrink and shrivel and disappear. And the moderate middle becomes stronger and stronger and finally dominate. And by the moderate middle, I do not mean Hindu and Muslim. I do not mean Hindu speaking and Tamil speaking. I do not mean North and South India. I mean we as human beings. And I'm sorry, Noreen, but again, I'm a Malayali. You keep forgetting that when you ask a question. I want to say that, when you look at the news that's filtering to you through the media or through social media or whatever it is, we find in the prism that almost the most dystopian view comes to the top. So when you look at the world through these prisms of information, it becomes a very dystopian world. And when you move among people, when you talk to people, I'm sure, talking to people in this room, you'll find very nice people. So what is this dystopian world that we live in as compared to the reality that the people we are mingling with are so nice, have such human qualities, So from that point of view, I'd only like to say that given the logic of the horror, frankly, that we underwent in 1947, I think these 3 things would have had a great difference in terms of preventing injuries, because you have a subcutaneous injury, an unseen injury, invisible injury, and you have an invisible injury in every faith. And today, you can see, efforts are there. And what is worrying me as a geopolitical person is efforts are on by outside forces. Efforts are on through use of the internet to launch many, many injuries, subcutaneous, cutaneous, on ridiculous grounds. And among the most ridiculous grounds is the ground of faith. Because frankly, it's an absurd ground. And I mean, for me, I mean, as a, living in my family, my mother converted to Islam. And before, she had converted about 10, 11 years before she declared that she was a Muslim publicly. I think she said that she saw some light in her room, and then she went to some literary conference and stunned everybody. And after she made that declaration, she called me and said, I'm going to make a declaration. Do you have any objection? Of course, look, your mother is your mother. It makes absolutely no difference, to a son, what religion a mother follows. The mother is the mother. So I said, me and my wife and my brothers and everything, we all said. And by the way, we have two adopted they're brothers, I would say, Irshad and Imtiaz, because when they were very, very young, they were blind, both of them. Visually challenged. And their parents could not basically educate them beyond a point. So my parents took them in and brought them up. They're very fine boys, and they're doing exceptionally well in life, which means that any challenge that you have, you can face. So the point I want to say is that I don't like to see this kind of divisions that are being erupting. It's not good for the future of our country. It's not good for common sense. It's not good for rationality. But I'm hoping that we're going to have a situation in which you have that. And I think that situation is to focus on an external kind of a threat, an external opportunity and an external threat. Make us forget our little differences with each other. Like when a family is under threat, the family comes together. And you've seen that happen in multiple cases. When you have a threat, everybody comes together. And that is why I would say Cold War 2.0 is important. We do have an external threat. We do have an external opportunity. So let's forget these stupid internal differences and let's grab that opportunity and let's confront that threat.
Good evening, sir. I'm a researcher. I have a question from academic perspective. Yesterday, I was reading about something about political geography and how internationalization of a state is happening everywhere. To me, from a researcher perspective, it was something which was not taught to me in masters, not taught in my PG. So, like you said, it's a new century. It's a new contours are there in international relations. So methodology is also, something which I find personally very challenging to, to be able to even approach research questions. So what would you advise me on that? And what's your take on that? Thank you.
I'd like you to think in a 360-degree way. First of all, don't rely on quote unquote experts. Most of them, all of them we always have a lag behind the times. When today, in a young country, you have to look to the future. You can't look to the past. If you look I don't drive, by the way, but I'm told that if you drive and look in the rearview mirror most of the time, you're going to have a problem. So I would advise you to look at hypotheses that have been discarded in the past, which may have been wrongly discarded, alternative hypotheses, alternative points of view. So take a 360-degree scan of a particular issue and a problem, and then come to your own conclusions about it. So that is the main thing I would tell you from an academic perspective, because a lot of us it's almost pre-designed where we look. And we go in the direction, sometimes you have a guide who also basically tells you this is the way it is. And you better write your thesis that way, or you're going to find it difficult to get your doctorate in time. But the reality is that there is a 360-degree angle to everything, to everybody. to every situation. So look at that 360 angle. That's my request.
Okay. So,
I'm sorry.
hello,
Yep,
sir.
go ahead.
I'm Mandara. I'm research scholar from Christ University, sir. So I wanted to ask you. I'm yet to read your book. Definitely, I'll do it after this. So before reading that, I want to read it with your insight on what do you think are the challenges to democracies or third world countries that are unique to Cold War 2.0, and what is the nature of this new Cold War? We have Joseph Nye's concept of soft power, smart power. So what do you think is the nature of this Cold War?
Let me put it this way, and let me talk about the opportunity to democracy. And when you talk about opportunity to democracy, let me talk of the smartphone in my pocket. This is very empowering. Even a dodo like me is now able to handle a smartphone to some extent, if I may say so, and a laptop. So in another 3-5 years, you're going to have a lot more empowering of the individual through smart technology, and through revolutionary technologies that are low cost. For example, recently we had a conference in Manipal on WALT, all capitals. I'm not a medical doctor, but they asked me to deliver the keynote address. And I finally understood why. Because, all these doctors who have been studying this WALT technology, which is actually a photo emission thing that basically affects your, the cells in your body, a photoelectric kind of light transmission. I am the representative of the population for whom they're working. I am the person who should be healed. They're the healers. And that's why you asked me to deliver the keynote. So I said, now I understand why I am, a person who did not know anything about Walt or whatever just 24 hours ago. I mean, I did when I was asked to give a keynote, but I never checked on the Google University or even our experts in Manipal. I said, I'm going to go there completely ignorant of it because I'm coming from that population. So from that point, this is very empowering. Technology is very, very empowering. So that is one of the great pluses that we are going through. Second is accessibility. Let's say we have a situation in which you have foolproof voting, improved biometrics, and you can vote through your smartphone. Then voting becomes 70, 80, 90, 100%. Bogus voting gets eliminated and true choices come. So first, technology is moving in the right direction. Two, we need to make sure that now if I've got my vote in Haryana. Let's say there was an election today, a national election or a Haryana state election. I'll have to go back to Gurgaon and cast my vote. Ridiculous. In the age of the internet, why should I go to Gurgaon and cast my vote? I can as well do it here, So that is the second point, frankly, that, you have to, accessibility is improving. And three, transparency is improving. Now, you may not like the crypto world or whatever it is. Crypto is being misused in the dark web for terrorism, for illegal activities and various other things. But it's a fact of life. Just as prohibition is something that poor Nitish Kumar has understood, you can't impose it. And the fact that nobody from Bihar, that he got a single medal at the Asian Games, I'm not going to link it to his prohibition policy the way other people have. There have been certainly a lot of other factors there. He needs to check on that. But the point is, technology is making transparency inevitable. And finally, you have to have a system in which every file, every decision can be monitored through the internet by the individuals for whose file is being done. You can have, if you don't have a situation by which everybody can access it, most files should be accessed by anybody. But at least those whose files are, who the relevant population, they should access the speed of that file. So with moving slowly, they should know. It should be visible on the internet. It is becoming technologically possible. And I think with civil society acting up, it will become, politically also, it will become inevitable. So essentially, by about 2029, 2027, 2029, I think you are going to see a strengthening of democracy. Now, I mean, you have a lot of colonial era laws. Now, again, thank God for the fact that you have the internet. You can check my writing on this. I've been opposed to something called criminal defamation. It's an absurdity. The Congress party was in power in 2004, 2014. They could have removed that particular law. They did not. And in fact, Chidambaram and Sibal, Chidambaram, I don't know where he was. Sibal is a good fellow, but, I mean, prone to believing that law can solve any issue. When, I'm sorry, apologies to the lawyer, it may not be able to. But, they could have removed that law and Rahul Gandhi would not have had to have a criminal charge. He would not have had this two-year prison sentence given to him. And he wouldn't have lost his MP thing for a second if he had only removed it. And I find it's very interesting for me how different a politician is in power and out of power. When they're in power, every single colonial law is wonderful, absolutely essential to good governance. When they're out of power, it's horrifying. It's terrible. You have to get rid of it. So poor Rahul Gandhi, maybe he didn't come across the criminal defamation law, but I didn't see too many of those laws being removed during that particular decade, frankly. So from my point of view, I'd like to say it's very important to move away from colonial governance systems and colonial law. Colonial governance systems are meant to control. Normal systems are meant to empower. You don't control the citizen, you empower them. And that move away has got to start. And that comes by decriminal, for example, 377, section 377 of IPC, that relating to a certain kind of relationship, was struck down by Supreme Court. They have not done that in the case of civil union. In my personal view, I see no harm if they had done that, frankly, because eventually it's the individual's right if somebody else is not affected. And if you believe that that right is not correct, you have the right to tell people that, you have the right to make your view known, but you don't have the right to use the police and the bludgeon of the law to enforce your preferences. I am a vegetarian. I'd like the whole world to be vegetarian, frankly. I think it's I think it's a good, from a sustainability point of view, it's probably a good diet. I am absolutely averse to any kind of legal restriction on any kind of diet, on any kind of dress, on any kind of lifestyle, because it is not the business of the courts and the police to monitor these things. It's not the business of officials, to monitor these things. It's the business of the individual, and it's the business of the social framework to have social discussions and discourses and come to your own individual conclusion about it. Because ultimately, young lady, why democracy will prevail is because you empower the individual, and more empowered the individual is, the stronger that country becomes. The reason why Britain became a major colonial power was because the British Queen was relatively weak compared to the French king. Before the poor chap got guillotined. Or the Spanish king. The Spanish king had absolute authority over his people. The British Queen didn't have that kind of authority. They had the Magna Carta more than 1,000 years ago. They had a lot more individual freedom. And the good thing about, London is that you can do what you like in London, so long as you do that to somebody who's not British. If you do something nasty to something, in financial terms, to somebody who's British, you're in trouble. But so long as you do it to somebody who's not British, you are left alone. which is why London is now the finance capital of the world. Dubai has now become the crypto capital of the world. And Dubai, when did Dubai become this flourishing city, this shining city on the hill? When a chap called Morarji Desai introduced the gold control order. For 2,000 years, people in India have been buying gold. A habit of 2,000 years. Neither Morarji Bhai nor anybody else could stop that. So what happened when you had the gold control order? You had a thriving business of smuggling gold into India. And the center point of that smuggling was Dubai. And that was the beginning of the Dubai miracle. And now Dubai is trying to reproduce that with crypto. In India, for some time we banned it, then we regulated it, then we taxed it, we must regulate it, we must tax it, but at levels and regulation where it still remains in India. We had about 60 to 70 million Indian citizens had crypto wallets. Today we have almost none. Those wallets have migrated to Chinese platforms. So the Chinese Communist Party knows how that money, the crypto, it's not money, it's not even an asset, it's crypto. How that crypto is being used or misused. Our people don't. How smart is that? So you create a situation in which it's totally dark what our people are doing with crypto, and to the Chinese Communist Party, it's very visible. So they want to blackmail, they can do it. And if we want to check illegal activity, we don't have that means. So that's what I mean by over-regulation, like Nitish's prohibition, frankly. I agree. Alcohol is not something that you should encourage, but you can't stop it by fiat. And Morarji's gold control order, you can't stop it. And then you had, Narasimha Rao removed it, smuggling stopped. Again, you brought in a tax on gold. Beyond a certain point, I think it was Chidambaram as finance minister who did that. Beyond in my view, about 4 or 5% level, again smuggling starts. And when you have smuggling, you have the mafia, you have gangs. I remember, I am, by the way, by my voting card, I'm not a Malayali, I'm a Haryanvi. And I'm very proud to be a Haryanvi. It's a very go-getting state. So if you look at I'm certified as a Haryanvi by my voter's card. But having said that, Bansilal thought he'll do prohibition. What happened? The mafia was hugely empowered after that. Haryana became unsafe because of prohibition. So I don't think that was Bansilal's idea, but that's what happened. So you drive it underground. And instead of putting it in the open. So it's far better to have it in the open where it's transparent. But the good news is by 2027 or 2029 at latest, technology will be able to make things transparent. So it's up to all of us as civil society to work for that kind of transparency and that adoption of technology. And I think I'm not therefore negative about the future of democracy, even in communist China. If you check my writing, when Qin Gang disappeared as foreign minister, I wrote that it means Xi Jinping is becoming weaker. Because Qin Gang was Xi Jinping's man, and Wang Yi is the CCP's man. So he's becoming weaker. So even there's a fight back. So it's important for all of us to work for transparency. It's important for all of us to work for pride in all the 7,000 or 8,000 years of Indian history. It's important for all of us to realize our common DNA. And if we do that, young lady, I can assure you, democracy will not, that light of democracy will absolutely not, go. And I want to say one thing in India, which gives me faith in India. Way back when I was in my, even before my teens and my teens, my father was working in Delhi and we used to travel by rail up to Kerala. And you would pass by village after village. And in a dark night, there were no lights in the villages because there was no money to buy oil lamp or whatever. But you would have lights there. You would have churches that were lit. You would have masjids that were lit. You would have temples that were lit. You would have a flickering light of a temple. In every village that you passed, you will see a temple there. Sometimes you see a mosque as well. Sometimes you see a church as well. Even if they have no money for their own homes, that light will be kept burning. So believe me, young lady, that flame of democracy will be kept burning by our people.
Hello, good evening, sir.
Hi.
So there are two parts to my question. Both of them relate to Cold War 2.0 and India's emerging role in that confrontation. Firstly, in your view, what should Indian policy and foreign policy be towards states in the South China Sea, particularly those which are having disputes with and fractious relations with China? For example, China has for long back propped up Pakistan with vast amounts of material aid, military aid, and had they not done so, it would have been far less of a nuisance to us, India. So similarly, should India be taking a more proactive military stance in terms of providing military aid to countries like, say, Vietnam, which have been antagonistic towards China? So we're taking some small steps in that regard. We have sold BrahMos to Philippines, transferred a missile corvette to Vietnam. Should we be more aggressive in that regard? And second part of that question is a continuation of that. So in the worst case scenario, if say there was conflict was to break out over Taiwan, if China were to invade Taiwan, what do you see or what do you envision India's role as in terms of military supplies? Do you believe we should be actively aiding in terms of resupplying Taiwan the way the West have been doing with Ukraine? And yeah, so basically what to know.
The first point I'd like to say is that I certainly believe that we made a mistake in not exporting our defense technology and in reserving defense technology for the public sector. Two huge mistakes we made. We should have opened defense technology to Indian companies across the board. The Indian private sector was very strong in 1947. By 1957, it was much weaker in terms of global comparison than it was in 1947, just after the war. So we should have opened it to private players, secondly, and we should have opened the field of defense exports to friendly countries. And that is an opportunity, young man, that I'm talking about. Friend shoring, high tech. Today in high tech, for example, Elon Musk produces, let's say his cars in China. Now, after a time, after some 3-4 years, he's not going to be able to sell those cars except in China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and a few other countries, because you can't trust the chips that are produced in China. That's why there's an effort to produce chips in India. So from that point of view, I'm glad two things have happened. One, during this regime, during this government, one, defense has been opened up to the private sector completely. Two, defense exports have been opened up, more or less every year, progressively, completely, and that is a very good thing. So far as Taiwan is concerned, in my view, definitely a threat to the Himalayan Massif, threatens all of the world that is confronting expansionist China. A threat to Taiwan also faces us. In my view, it's likely to be a blockade of Taiwan. It will begin with a blockade of Taiwan. In my view, one of the Quad, for example, has the ability to enforce a blockade of Chinese vessels from the Persian Gulf through the Malacca Straits. And if you do that, you choke China. And if the Chinese know you're going to do that, they're never going to blockade Taiwan. Please understand, I didn't write this book to start a war. I wrote this book to create deterrence to a war. So if you are working actively on a blockade of China, if they blockade Taiwan, you are deterring an attack on Taiwan. You are not promoting an attack on Taiwan. So from my point of view, the Quad definitely should work towards that, and there should be a Quad Plus with Vietnam as part of it, Indonesia a part of it, Malaysia a part of it, and other countries a part. Vietnam very definitely a part of it. There has to be this kind of a Quad Plus, because ultimately, as you correctly said, if there's a kinetic action, there'll be a kinetic response. I want to end on a slightly, I track events a lot. And I track events, I would say more or less as far as possible firsthand through actual, the sources, let's put it that way. What happened in Galwan? if you look at the mathematics of it, and the Chinese Communist Party leadership are full of engineers, they look at mathematics, and and for them it's all mathematics. Now the world doesn't move strictly according to law, unfortunately. It doesn't move strictly according to lawyers, unfortunately. It moves according to different things. It doesn't move according to mathematics. Mathematically, the Indian army was much weaker than the PLA. But human to human, and one other good thing this government has done, it has opened the armed forces to women. Women are, I'm a matriarchal, my name is a matriarchal name, so let me say women are braver than men are. Being from a matriarchal family, I don't dare as a man say anything different. I have to say women are braver than men are, but I do believe that. But but again, the fact of the matter is it opened now you have women as well in the military. I'm glad that's happening now. You have that in many militaries. It's a great add-on to the military. But in Galwan, what happened? Our boys come from Bihar and UP and places like that. These guys have seen hardship. The soldiers of Chairman Mao saw hardship. They saw suffering. Some of them saw starvation. Some of our boys who are fighting in the front, I've been there, I know that, they have seen real hardship in their lives. They're tough cookies, if you pardon the expression. The Chinese who attacked them, these are single children, and very importantly, single male children. Now look at single male children in any family, and you may find the odds are not very low that may be a slightly spoiled brat. Maybe, not always, but sometimes. These single male kids were sent into battle against kids who have known hardship in their youth, toughies, who have known adversity, and who frankly are fighters. The Indian army has been in a situation where they face hostile fire. You have friendly fire, accidental fire, and you have hostile fire. People aiming at you to kill you. They have faced hostile fire throughout their life in the military. The PLA soldier has faced hostile fire in front of a video console or in front of a military exercise. Now, I watched some of those exercises. I wasn't invited to the video consoles, and thank God, but I watched the exercises. That's great, but it's an exercise. It's different from facing real fire when you know something horrible can happen to you. And in the days in the 1990s, when I used to go to places which were under hostile fire in some parts of India, that particular fear, that particular alertness, you don't have in a situation where this is simulated. So that kind of individual they were facing. And believe me, when these guys came at them with their sticks, with their iron thing pointed at them, and with their stones or whatever they had, our chaps had bayonets in their pockets. There was a CBM. Some professor, I think, recommended a CBM that, the India-China border, there should be no ammunition, there should be no guns, no live ammo, thinking very stupidly that would mean that there would be no war and no fighting. That professor did not reckon on bludgeons and stones and that kind of activity. So he wasn't very smart. But the reality is, frankly, our chaps, fortunately, they had no bullets in their guns, but they had bayonets. And they made use of those bayonets. It's very unfortunate. It's horrifying. Human life is terrible. But according to satellite data, about 60 PLA soldiers lost their lives. According to the Russians, it was 53. And the Russians, of course, kept silent after that. They didn't say anything more. Mr. Xi silenced them. But about 60 of them for 20 of our people. The mistake the Chinese made, one, taking on troops who are battle-hardened. And they are anything but battle-hardened. And two, killing the commanding officer. Accidentally or otherwise, the commanding officer of the battalion fell off a cliff, a crevice, I think it was pushed by some PLA person. The Indian military tradition is very clear. If your CEO is killed by the enemy, you forget about your own life. You go after the enemy and make the enemy pay. So our guys must have gone completely and totally berserk at Galwan. And there's nothing more terrifying than a berserk, individual coming at you with a bayonet. And believe me, from that time onwards, no Chinese soldier is very keen on remaining in the Himalayan frontier, confronting Indian soldiers for longer than he can manage. Maybe a few months, and then they rotate. Our chaps stay there for much longer time. They're not afraid. So the human element in a kinetic war is what made the difference in Galwan. The human element is what made the difference in Vietnam. The human element has made the difference in many wars that have been fought. Many, many wars. So that is, but I agree, apart from the human element, you need an alliance element, you need a logistics and supply element, as in the case of Ukraine. But what we need to do, if Taiwan is concerned, we have to consult with our Quad members, in my opinion, and enforce a blockade from the Persian Gulf to the Malacca Straits of Chinese vessels and vessels carrying cargo to China if China imposed the blockade of Taiwan. That is the one way of not entering a war, but preventing a war. Sir.
China many times. So, did you go as for holiday, or you had some family relations, or
No,
very sightseeing?
I am a UN Peace Chair. Believe it or not, I think I'm probably the first or the second UN Peace Chair. And for a long time, the track that was there was better relations between India and China. So technically, I think that was a very good reason to go to China. And it was only around, I must confess, around 2013, 2014, I began to wonder whether I was entirely right in that lamp of hope, the light of that lamp of hope, that there can be, the Communist Party of China will understand that you can be friendly with a lot of countries, but it makes no difference if you make India hostile. This one country is more important to you than any of these other countries, especially if it teams up with a country like the United States. I hope that they would understand that. Around 2013, 2014, I began losing that hope. By around 2017, I lost it almost entirely. And by about 2019, I became an open hawk, while still a UN professor of peace. And now I am asking for peace through deterrence. I am not calling for war. I am calling for deterrence. And that's why I'm saying if we confront China now and we deter China now, we avoid World War III. I don't want to provoke World War II. World War II was provoked because France and Britain ignored the reality of what is happening in Germany. They did not come together. An isolationist United States ignored the reality of the Nazis in Germany and the kind of system they did. As a consequence, war came. And the alliance came in 1941, when so many lives were lost and the war was advanced. I say that we are around 1937 in Europe, before the Czech surrender. Now is the time to create a deterrence. And if that deterrence had been created in Europe, there would not have been a Second World War. If Hitler's army had marched and they had been defeated in the Sudetenland or in the Rhineland, Hitler would have been finished. The First World War was caused by a multiplicity of causes. Second World War was caused by Hitler. The Third World War, if it is caused, will be caused by this expansionist drive of the CCP top leadership. Again, I don't want to blame the CCP for it. I don't want to blame the leadership for it. But the top leadership, this obsession with control and supremacy that they have, it will be caused by that. So if you create a deterrent that you did not create in the previous century, you can avoid the kind of war that we faced in the previous century. And that's my point. Ma'am.
makes you feel
Yeah.
that we are going to be successful in that attitude of deterrence? When you say that China is a lot more developed, has been, and also you mentioned that empowerment and democracy is one of the ways in which we could strengthen. And you also said China does not have it, hardly 1% or 1% or 1% deals with it, and yet it is successful. So I noticed, maybe I didn't understand you, contradictions in what you said. Would you clarify that for
You're
me?
quite right about that. And you're perfectly right that for a long time, China was successful by a centralized control system. In a knowledge system, a knowledge ecosystem, crazy minds create better. The reason why Indians do very well in the knowledge industry, our minds are a little more crazy, a little less organized, and a little more less orderly than the Chinese or the Japanese or the German mind. So we're doing better. So, point one, we were not really attuned to the mechanical age or the chemical age. Chemical age a little better. Mechanical age, that kind of orderliness, somehow as a people, we didn't have it. But the knowledge era is an era of chaos theory. And we are living in chaos. Believe me, coming from Reva University to here, I know what chaos is. And I saw smiling faces all the way. I mean, all down the way, I saw people who were smiling, laughing, so some were frowning, but the overwhelming majority were not bothering about the chaos around them. So that is one reason why. And second is, and I think it's a very, very good question that you asked me, frankly. I'm very glad that you're not a student of mine, because then you would have asked me some pretty nasty questions, and I've had to, then my ignorance would have been revealed. So I'm delighted about that. But today, technology, the point is you have to friend-shore technology, because technology is dual use. That little chip that you have, that micro little chip, can both be used to kill people and to heal people, to help people and to harm people. So given that risk, advanced technology is now moving away from China. So it's no longer, and the third thing is, you have to have minds a little free. Now, when you go back to the Soviet Union, in the old Soviet days, I mean, even when I was, let's say, late 20s, 30s and all that, one did travel. You found science cities in the Soviet Union. And in the science cities, you found foreign goods. All the shops had foreign goods. These guys would use their certificates, they wouldn't be given dollars, and they would buy these foreign goods. And they would say horrible things about Brezhnev, who at that point in time, or whoever it was, and Chernenko or Brezhnev or whoever it was, even Gorbachev at that point in time. Nothing happened to them, because the Soviets understood that the scientific mind needs a certain degree of ambient freedom. You have to be free to express your views, however horrible they are, to how unpalatable they are to others, so long as they don't harm others. And these little science colonies were totally different from the rest of the Soviet Union. If you go outside that bubble and you're not a top scientist or one of these top engineer, and you talk against Brezhnev, believe me, you would not be having a very pleasant time, and neither would your family. But in China, that kind of regimentation is leading to, now you saw what happened to Alibaba. Poor old Jack Ma was told to give whatever data he had to the PLA. Now, Alibaba said, for God's sake, our big markets are in the Europe, US, India. If we give all our data to you and they feel that you are an enemy army, we won't be able to do business there. Sorry, you give data or you pay for it. And Mr. Jack Ma, poor chap, he didn't have a very good time. I don't know where he is now, but he disappeared again. So all these techie companies now have to transfer data obligatorily to the PLA. Now, how are you going to trust your high technology to them? How are you going to trust Chinese companies with your electrical transmission? How are you going to trust Chinese companies with your transportation, with your, with your health infrastructure? A large part of our electronic equipment comes from China. Now, the modern chips that are there, there could be Trojans in them. So that is where now, over the last 2 or 3 years, a clear effort is on to start buying friendshoring or to produce locally. It's not done, it's done out of necessity. So 2 answers, which I have told you. The first answer, of course, that the chaotic, crazy Indian mind has an advantage over the nice, neat, orderly Japanese, German, or Chinese mind. And secondly, high technology has to be friend-shored. And the Chinese Communist Party is not the friend of many countries, which is why technology is moving. And which is why in 1927, I got the Eureka moment. That the reason why these guys will never accept a rising India is because we are the only competitor to them. Like America will not want a strong Russia. Russia is the only competitor to America and Europe. You can't blame Uncle Joe for taking advantage of Ukraine and arming Ukraine to the teeth. Poor Ukrainians. It's tragic what's happening to them. For the same reason as the Americans don't want Russia to grow, China doesn't want India to grow. So it took a while, but being a little bit of a, I would like to use the word diplomatic. If you're undiplomatic, you can use the word cowardly, but whatever it is. But the fact is, overtly, I started showing my feelings about my lack of hope that the CCP top leadership will ever understand that India is there. Basically, it's too important a country to this thing. And then I realized why. Because if India develops, it will be at their expense. And that is the expansionist mindset. I grow at somebody else's expense. If you have a mindset that says, I grow, you grow, it's healthy. If you say, I grow and you die, it's a cancerous mindset. And that mindset is the expansionist mindset. It was there in Europe, it's there now in Asia.
Talking about the fringe taking over. If that is going to happen, how are you going to get a very strong India throwing that gauntlet to China? You're talking about how the fringe and the middle path, for want of a better expression, a Buddhist middle path is what you advocated. And that's where you saw the sort of redemption of India to a certain extent. But how do you see that happening if the center cannot hold and the centripetal forces gain ground? How do you see that happening?
I personally believe that the center will hold, and it is definitely going to hold. And when I go around the country, for example, when I see social media conversations, they're very fringe-oriented. They're full of hate. I hate this, I hate that, I hate you, you hate me, that kind of stuff. When you see people, it's different. When you see real people, when you see real communities, it's different. So if I started seeing that in people that I'm mixing and meeting with, I'd be afraid. If I'm seeing it in social media, as I told you, there are algorithms, there are intrusions and that kind of thing. I can justify on that ground. But eventually, I'd like to say, hate is a very self-defeating emotion. Hate is for destructing. The other emotion of love is for creation. So you love something, you create. You hate something, you destroy. And again, I go back to Mahatma Gandhi. I was not a great admirer of Gandhiji when I wrote Indutva, I must confess. But today I'm beginning to appreciate him more and more. And he did say something very profound. An eye for an eye ultimately makes the whole world blind. So the last point I want to make is the obduracy of this English language. In Bihar, in UP, in Chhattisgarh, in Madhya Pradesh, You have politicians saying, Angrezi hatao. And you have people in the villages telling me, Kya Angrezi hatao? I am selling my wife's necklace so that our child can get educated in English. I mean, the kind of, it's amazing. The desire to learn English. If only the state had facilitated that. But from 1947 onwards, the teaching of English has been neglected. I see English as a weapon of war for a prosperous society. It's a weapon that unlocks more of a 360-degree vision. You can see a lot more if you know English and refer to English books than if you refer to it in books in many other languages. It's a fact of life. It's not because the language is good or the language is bad. And that is why I wrote something called the 21st Century Anglosphere, in which I said that Churchill said the Anglosphere was Britain, Australia, Canada, the US, on race, the blood of the body. I said, no, it's the blood of the mind. And if you look at the country with the largest number of English-speaking people, even today, in my view, it's India. So all that, the young Bihari boy who tells me, Kya Angrezi hatao? Mujhe Angrezi seekhna hai. He doesn't see it as, I speak a bit of English here and there. I've written, I am called in some circles a very aggressive, hate-filled, horrible Indian nationalist, or sometimes a religious tag is put to me, or sometimes an anti-religious tag is put to me. I don't know. I've always written in a very aggressive manner, but I've always said English is essential because I want to see a prosperous India. And English is important for that. So why throw that advantage away? You understand? So with all this, the people I'm seeing around me, I feel optimistic, very frankly. As I said, I'm glad you're not my student. But, and I'd like to say that these are very prescient questions, frankly. They go right to the core of the matter. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much indeed. God bless you. God bless you.